schedule for the last part of our day's session, where I have here a whole set of questions that the rest of you have generated over lunch, and I'm just going to go through them one by one and see what our panelists can tell us. They're not addressed to any particular person, as far as I can see, so we'll probably go
All
around
of the hard questions are for David.
He's gone. Yeah, so, but we'll go around and have each one of you take a little bit of a stab at it, and we'll start this way and then we'll go back. So this is, what will be the future of Taiwan and Hong Kong, and how will this affect U.S.-China relations?
Oh boy, starting with a small one. I'm not a specialist in international relations, so I'll just say a little brief comment, and I actually mentioned this when we were at lunch as well. One thing that needs to be considered is that in recent years there's been a dramatic increase in the influx of mainland Chinese tourists on Taiwan and in Hong Kong, and the response on the part of people who, natives of Taiwan and Hong Kong, has been very negative actually toward the mainland Chinese tourists. So rather than this kind of increased interaction building an increased sense of camaraderie or fellowship, it actually seems to have had the opposite effect. So in that sense, going back to the question, I don't see many signs that the future of Taiwan is going to be closer to mainland China, and I don't see many signs that the future for Hong Kong, at least if the Hong Kong people have any say, is going to be any closer to China.
More of the same. Okay. Benjamin?
So I will also say I'm not a specialist in international relations. Of course, that's not the right way to view Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China. But neither am I a specialist of the future. But let me try. I would say, first of all, what was said earlier by Clay is I think very correct, that for younger people in Taiwan and Hong Kong, the mainland government is just not very popular. I wanted to add something to that the economic integration, not just between Hong Kong and China, but Taiwan and China, is so strong that they're forever knitted together at the fundament, even more than the US and China, I would say. So I think that makes very limited wiggle room on any side. And the last thing I would say is it's extremely sensitive on all sides. So things can be a little bit volatile, although I would agree with David that I don't see any indication that there's going to be war or anything like that, especially between the mainland and Taiwan. But now we leave it to the specialists.
Clay?
Oh, not a specialist, but as Benjamin said, the one thing you can't say in Beijing is that this is an international. The one thing that you may not say in Beijing is that this has anything to do with international affairs. The Chinese argue that it's a family matter, and your opinions, while they may tolerate them and listen to them, are not key, right? So that's the place where the official Chinese position is. Having said that, I think that we saw that the government in Beijing used restraint in dealing with the situation in Hong Kong. They simply waited it out. And that, again, Xi Jinping's not calling Teresa, he has yet to call me. But that would have been my advice too, because any sort of intervention, direct intervention, would have had a much bigger impact than many of the things that happen in China every day, because Hong Kong is an international city, fully connected to the international media and things like that. Yeah, I would suggest that people will continue to muddle along in both places. President Ma in Taiwan came in and put forward this notion of about a flexible strategy in dealing with the mainland. And he also used that in dealing with Japan. And so Taiwan and Japan actually managed to work out an arrangement wherein Taiwanese fishermen were able to access the waters around the Senkaku, or as they call it in Taiwan, the Diaoyutai. And so what the strategy there is to solve the solvable, cooperate where you can, set the big issues of sovereignty aside, and just find ways to make things work. And in the case of Taiwan, they've had enormous success over the last maybe 15 years in expanding these ties. A couple of years ago already, there were 3 million Chinese tourists a year visiting Taiwan. You can fly to Taiwan from every Chinese city, or from every large Chinese city, and people are doing that. And one wonders about the impact on those visitors. We know that they go shopping. We know that they enjoy visiting museums and scenic spots and things like that. But they often also comment on the civility that they see in Taiwan and speak of it in a very positive way. And so I think that's significant. One thing it was brought up first by Teresa, Chinese tourists are going everywhere. They're certainly coming here. We've got South Coast Mall and everybody else is trying to learn Chinese. Outlet malls, you can get an extra $1 an hour if you speak Chinese. And, of course, nobody will, they can't hire people at that rate. And so the influx is tremendous. I put my nephew on a plane a couple days ago, and he was flying to Palau. And I actually know where Palau is. But some of you do. The only reason I know that Palau exists, let alone where it is because the U.S. government sent a number of Uyghurs there when they couldn't figure out what to do with them at Guantanamo Bay. But Palau only has 21,000 people, but last year they had 50,000 Chinese tourists.
Oh my God.
And my nephew is going to build a hotel to absorb more of them. So Chinese tourists, almost 1.4 billion folks, all want to see the world.
Okay, I think I'll ask Benjamin to lead off with this so that Clay can save his voice for the next round. Here it says, how will the Chinese system provide, by GDP growth, provide employment for college graduates? Are college graduates a problem getting jobs for them? And if so, what can the government or the society do?
Wow, those are two questions in one.
Sorry.
That's great. I mean, it is one question, but it's two issues. So one issue is growth. Can China sustain growth? That's a huge question. There's so many sides to that. Let me tackle that one first and give you my 5 cents on that. There is real challenges to the sustained growth. First of all is the law of growth. No country can sustain the levels of growth that China has been sustaining for so long, for much longer. There just is not a history. If you look at the history of economic growth, it is actually very, very low growth is the norm. And since the industrial revolution, we see higher periods of growth that then level off to the 2, 3, 4%, if we're very lucky, level, but often much lower. So the law of economics or economic history is China will have lower growth. Law in China has been growth should be around 8, and now they've said it can be a bit lower. Because otherwise there's a problem. So that's the first part of it. There will be lower growth. China is done catching up at some point, and it's had catch-up growth, which is not a condiment, but catch up. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure you understand my Dutch English. The second part of this is the structural problems. Let us first talk about one that I don't think is being addressed enough in popular media, which is the aging problem. My colleague Wang Feng at UCI Sociology is, I think, one of the most influential thought leaders on China's aging problem. So when I speak with him, I learned the following. If you have an aging population, that affects growth on so many levels. One level is savings. So if at some point the elder people there is a very large group of elderly people, they will use their own savings to support themselves, and there's not going to be new savings. It will decrease the labor force. It's another problem. It'll increase health costs, which is obvious. So it's these things that together make aging a major issue. Then we get into the problem of the real estate sector. There's different views on that, but there may well be a bubble. Then we get into the problem of debt. The Economist, I think it was a week ago, had a whole story on Chinese debt. We had Victor Shi from San Diego, from UC San Diego, do a talk about debt and Chinese growth. And he argues that China has a tremendously large amount of debt, and that the real problem with it is the interest it's paying. It pays a high interest, and at some point that will also undermine growth. So there are a lot of indicators to show that the growth is not here to stay. The other side of the story is people have been saying this a long time. And China has surprised everybody the last 5 years, I would say. So again, I'm not an expert on the future. Let me now get to the graduates. If Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao had called me, probably they wouldn't have, but there wouldn't have been a reason at the time. But if there was a time machine and I could talk with them now, I would probably advise them maybe go a little bit easy on the investment in higher education. Because you're going to get a whole bunch of graduates that not only may not have jobs, but even if there's jobs, the jobs are not going to pay that well. So maybe you want to invest more in vocational training and get that middle group going. And that is definitely something that's worrying. I think if you look back at '89, the student movement then, we also had a large group of graduates that weren't easily going to get jobs and had trouble with that. We might be going into a similar direction.
Teresa.
I'll mainly comment on the question of college graduates as well, and just to kind of fill in a little more background on what's been going on there. So up until the early 1990s, if you were able to get a place in college, which was, it was, first of all, it was extremely difficult to get into a four-year university in China up through 1989. Only a tiny, tiny percentage of even applicants were able to successfully be admitted. If you were admitted, though, college was basically free. After 1989 and kind of starting in the early 1990s, the fee structure changed for institutions of higher education so that they had to fund the majority of their expenses, and as a result, tuition has skyrocketed. So it is no longer free to go to university in China. At the same time, the number of spaces was opened up dramatically. So you have a lot more opportunity to go to college. However, it's really only become available to the wealthiest members of Chinese society. So the average kind of college student in China today is male, has an urban residential permit or hukou, and comes from a relatively well-to-do family, and is an only child. So you kind of put that all together, and then you have more and more of these folks graduating, and I would agree more than is really needed given sort of the stage of development for China. And there just aren't enough jobs available, and these graduates have a sense of kind of entitlement and pride, and a sense that they are of a higher status or quality, and that they're not willing to do jobs that they see to be sort of beneath them. And then meanwhile, you have this massive influx of rural youths coming from the countryside who are willing to do any kind of job in the city. So they have competition for even kind of the lower paying jobs, and are seen as kind of more hardworking, more obedient than an urban youth who, has this kind of privileged mentality. So it's a real problem, and the more and more that this group of people, these college graduates, is not happy with their status, yeah, it could lead to some real problems for the regime. Solutions? I'm not sure.
Well, none of us are. Okay, going on, I'll go back now to Clay and ask you to lead off with this one. China's economic slowdown, is it a threat to development, or is it a planned slowdown to control overdevelopment? We haven't heard that as an explanation, but it's possible. And how do how do these changes relate to this policy to shift from an export economy to a consumer economy?
The Chinese leadership will tell you that it's a planned slowdown, that everybody knew this was inevitable, and they're ahead of it. That's why they've adjusted their targets lower and lower. And partly it's to make the kinds of adjustments that need to be made. And one of the things actually that ties the last set of questions together with this one is there's a lot of areas in China that could stand development, that could stand infrastructural investment, could stand expanded educational opportunities, things like that. The problem is to get anybody who lives in Beijing or Shanghai out of Beijing or Shanghai. It's just extremely difficult to coax anyone to do that, the notion of going to these frontier areas. So what China wants to do, of course, is to have its 1.3 billion people become the engine of economic growth, for everybody to buy a washing machine, to buy this, to buy that. And in fact, there have been stimulus measures during, in 2007, 2008, 2009, there were these kinds of incentives where the government subsidized the purchase of washing machines and things like that, where local governments were encouraged to buy automobiles that they didn't need and couldn't afford, but they needed to do those to move those cars. And so the Chinese government uses all sorts of tools to try to achieve these things. The basic problem, though, is what most people at the lower end of the economic system get is barely enough to keep them alive, given the increase in prices and to do all of those kinds of things. They don't have the wherewithal to buy more. And if they do get any more, what they do is save it. And they save it for a couple of reasons. They save partly if they're parents of a child, of a son, they have to come into this marriage with a house, with an apartment. I got married in 1983 in Jinan. And at that time, I had the three things that you had to have in addition to a willing partner. And that was three things that went around: a bicycle, a watch, and a sewing machine. If I had had to come up with an apartment, I would have been out of luck. Okay, so it's a very high threshold, and the family has to save to make this kind of thing possible. And one of the things that is happening is that people in China are marrying at more advanced ages. And in fact, right now in Shanghai, the average age at first marriage, and it's also a place where there are a lot of second marriages now, but the average age at first marriage is older than in the United States. The average man marries in Shanghai at 30, and the average woman at 28, which means she's already endured at least a year of horrific pressure from all of her relatives to get married, right? This kind of thing. So in any case, I haven't directly answered the question. The problem is, how do you get money into the pockets of people who will spend it? You have to create a system wherein healthcare is certain, pensions are certain, that sort of thing. And, perhaps pass out of this real estate bubble so that housing becomes more affordable, or that expectations, and this is my hope, is that young people's expectations of what they have to get married will change. But for the government actually looks like it's given up on consumption. I think this rebalance is still the dream, but they're back to infrastructure, they're back to investment.
Benjamin?
So again, this is a very complex question. I agree with Clay that they will tell you that this is all the plan. And of course, nobody can plan the things that are so complex as this. I think what we should all be hoping for is that China prevents the bursting of a real bubble and instead it goes into froth, where you have these tiny bubbles that get pinched, as Alan Greenspan calls it. I think another issue here is, can it develop a different model for growth? So I think a consumer-based model that we all have problems with, because at the end it becomes a debt-based model, which I think we have developed in our time since the 80s, but that hasn't been the model that has been sustainable earlier. And I think we're having problems with that in Europe, and the US is having problems with that. And China could still prevent having problems with that. So I think there's still a much broader choice there as it cools down. It definitely has to get off the real estate drugs. So real estate has been the major way in which local governments get income, and it's very harmful. And of course, we have the same kind of problems. Finally, we have to also look at, and that's the thing that I didn't discuss, at banks and the financial institutions. Under Zhu Rongji, there was a major, so early 2000s, a major bank reform, and late 1990s. Under Hu Jintao, this was undone to a certain extent. What worries me a lot, apart from the real estate bubble and the aging and the amount of debt, is more the amount of bad debt. And especially since the crisis, the flood, there's been so much credit going to infrastructure projects and other projects that may not work out, that create a very risky basis for the economy. So I hope they find a third way, not just infrastructure investment or consumption through credit, but more a real value proposition that is China's own model.
Teresa?
Sure, I'll just add a couple of things, kind of piggybacking on what Clay said. In order to move effectively toward more consumption-based growth, something has to be done about the unequal distribution of wealth. So if there just simply aren't enough people who have enough extra income to buy things that they don't really need in order to survive, you can't really move there. And China today has one of the most unequal distributions of wealth in the world, up there, right there with us, the US and Brazil and those countries that we consider to be the most economically unequal on the planet. Another reason why it's certainly ironic to call China a communist country today. Beyond that, though, there are serious problems, and I think the question is, can even a pragmatic government that kind of consults the best economic experts in the world about how to deal with these very serious problems pull this off? I think if any government has a chance of doing it, it is the Chinese government. And one thing that I will say, going back to my point about pragmatism, is one of the frustrations that I feel as an American is I feel that oftentimes when the American government or society is confronted with a problem, the answer is driven by ideology and driven by kind of political infighting, trying to win a political or ideological battle, and not driven by what will work best to solve this problem. That could be how to manage the economy, it could be how to create a healthcare system. And in China, the leadership hasn't seemed to be constrained by ideological sort of ideals. Rather, it has been the question of what works best. So when confronted with a problem like how to transition the economy, they find the people around the world who they believe are kind of the best experts on these topics and consult with them. And I think the same thing has happened to a large extent with the environment. But again, the question is the problem so hard to resolve that even the best and brightest can't resolve it?
Okay, let's go on to the next question, and we'll ask, who started?
I started.
Okay, Teresa,
Okay.
keep you talking. Do we and Chinese understand each other's basic values and attitudes? Is there a problem of superiority complexes? And if so, how can we improve relations, particularly as students go from one place to the other?
I think there's definitely sort of a superiority complex that many Americans have toward Chinese, and maybe superiority complex isn't the right sort of phrase. I think many Americans sort of feel sorry for the Chinese. Those poor Chinese, they're subject to these dictatorial rulers who try to put up a great firewall to prevent them from communicating on the internet or accessing information. They get thrown in jail for no reason, and there's labor camps, which are, supposedly now being dismantled. But we feel sort of sorry for the Chinese. And I think if you ask most Chinese, they find this kind of condescending, and that they're actually not all a bunch of brainwashed and people who are unable to think and unable to express their real views. So I think one thing that Americans would be wise to do is, first of all, recognize that there's much more going on in China than just a repressed society sort of suffering under a totalitarian regime, and to kind of take seriously what Chinese people say about, their own situation and about their government as well, and not sort of in a condescending or sort of parental way say, well, if only you were more like us, everything would be fine.
Clay? Benjamin? Yes. Yeah, Benjamin and then Clay, yeah.
And I would immediately continue that with starting to talk about what is us. So when we talk about China, we often implicitly compare China with something here, whether that for me is a certain type of Europe or for you is a certain type of America. For instance, in the legal sphere, I often find that when we talk about Chinese courts, we're talking about things that happen in lower level courts, and we implicitly compare it with the best courts in the US. Of course, the US is a huge country. You find the most horrible things here. And you could also in Europe. You find both very positive things and you find more difficult things. What I found in my own experience in China working with environmental authorities, the only way to get a good conversation going, and for instance I had that when I was involved in training environmental law enforcement officials from throughout China, we don't talk with them about all the great things that we did in the Netherlands. First of all, these things don't translate well into China. Second of all, that's not a way to start the conversation, even though the Chinese do want us to start there. What I do instead is to talk about all the challenges we have in Holland. So even though they think, oh, Holland is this really great environmental country and has great law enforcement, we talk about, look, we have these and these and these and these and these problems. Then the Chinese at some point say, wow, we have them too. Then we talk about how we dealt with these problems. They say, well, we tried this and this. Then you have a more direct conversation. So I think it starts by recognizing that some of the fundamental issues that Chinese are facing, we are facing too. Some of the accomplishments they've made, well, are the kind of things we might be trying to do ourselves. So I think a more balanced comparison is vital.
Clay?
I will be uncharacteristically short. I agree with what others have said, because I think there is sort of a hubris about a country that wants to change the world, that thinks of itself as exceptional, and that, of course, is a debate. A hot debate in the United States right now, right? Is the United States an exceptional country? We certainly think we are, and so do the Chinese. The Chinese think they are exceptional. And so we wind up sometimes not being able to communicate very well on that level. But the reality is that we do cooperate a lot. And for those of you who picked up that blue-covered document, one of the points in there is that every day people in the United States work with people in China to solve problems. A lot of these are economic problems, right? How we can make widgets better, faster, cheaper, more colorful, more attractive. But we also do this in healthcare. We also do this in sanitation. The city of Redondo Beach has a cooperative arrangement where they work with a small town near Shanghai where they basically are learning how to manage roads. The two sides are learning how to manage roads, how to use a database and to have regular repairs so that you don't have failures and things like that. There's work in virtually any field that you can imagine. There is cooperation. And where that cooperation is most effective is where both sides speak frankly and listen really, really well.
Okay, I think, Teresa, I haven't asked you to lead off yet, have I? Not recently. It's okay. This one, how do perceived human rights issues in China affect U.S.-China relations?
Well, it kind of depends on the behavior of the Chinese government and the behavior of the U.S. government. One thing I would say, though, is it is pretty unclear whether or not U.S. pressure on China to improve its human rights record has been effective. It's been somewhat effective in individual cases, but in terms of more broadly improving the human rights situation in China, very little evidence of any clear effect. That's not to say that the U.S. should abandon efforts to pressure China in this regard. But it's difficult to do so effectively do so given China's economic weight, especially these days. But one example is after the Tiananmen Square protests, the crushing of the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989, there was talk of, well, what are you going to do to the Chinese? We can't just sit back and let them get away with this. And the U.S. did try to have trade sanctions on China at the time, and other advanced industrial countries didn't go along with that. So ultimately, the U.S. abandoned this plan. So it's very difficult to have kind of effective pressure with regard to human rights. The example of Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Prize winner who was jailed back in 2008 for publishing the famous Charter 08 online, we haven't had much of an impact in that regard as well. On the other side, though, I have to say I remain sort of puzzled by the regime's, what I consider to be paranoia of people like Liu Xiaobo. And in fact, since the early 1990s, I've seen very little evidence that true political dissidents in China, who do exist, and I've talked to a number of them and studied and written about them, that they've gained any traction beyond a very, very tiny circle of people. So why doesn't the Chinese leadership ignore them? So sort of like with Hong Kong, you're better off with the umbrella movement, just sort of letting it run its course, letting them do their thing. And it's almost as if the Chinese leadership can't help itself in some circumstances, like with Liu Xiaobo. So from the Chinese side, I think they'd be better off just letting the dissidents spout off. They're probably not going to gain any traction with the general public as long as the regime is perceived by the general public as doing a good job of governing.
Benjamin, yes.
So also, I mean, this is a very broad question. Let me go into the human rights part of it. So I think there's two distinct elements here. One is the well-known political dissidents, rights defenders, rights activists that we know. These are the individual cases, such as Liu Xiaobo. I think Liu Xiaobo is not the worst case. Worst case is probably Gao Zhisheng, We don't know where he is. He's a human rights lawyer that actually started as a real estate lawyer, then got involved in some Falun Gong cases and other things. At some point, he disappeared for a year or more, came back, was tortured in jail, was out again, talked a little bit about this, and then disappeared again. What can we do for those cases? I don't think international pressure directly helps. What does help is always talking about them. If people have disappeared, you want to talk about them. My dear colleague Jerry Cohen at NYU, with whom I taught, he always mentions these people. Everywhere he goes, every speech he does, every op-ed he writes, he will go back and mention them. So I think you want to make sure that these people don't just disappear, but that they also are still there, even though we don't see them. So that's one part of it. A broader part that I know much more about is the kind of human rights violations that are systemic in the criminal justice system. And of course, again, here we have to talk about, that's not just Chinese, right? I mean, there are issues in many criminal justice systems. And it's in this field, actually, that I think US has a very special role to play, because it itself has these problems. Look, if Holland goes to China to talk about the death penalty, we only have one message, which is abolish. Well, that's not a good message in China. That's not going to get you anywhere. When US legal scholars go to China to talk about death penalty as well as criminal procedure, they talk about real issues that they face in their own systems and that they've tried to deal with. I've seen some of these projects get traction. Again, to take Jerry Cohen as one of the people, and he's really somebody who works well with China and is critical at the same time. Through the collaboration over the years, first of all, we see that pro-human rights reform related specialists from China have gotten support from the US. So in the criminal justice sphere, we see that in 2012, the criminal law was amended to include now an exclusionary rule that is similar to the US, where evidence that has been obtained under duress or torture should not be admissible in the courtroom. That's huge. Will it work in practice? Well, I'm a skeptic because I study implementation. But it's a start. And it's a start that comes out of some form of engagement. I think it's that engagement, if we look, that is really vital. My third point, and this is much broader, what are human rights violations? We normally talk about political dissidents, we normally talk about the criminal justice sphere. I claim I work on the largest human rights violations. I just told you earlier, 1 in 6 Chinese gets seriously ill because of industrial pollution. 1 in 4 farmers have lost their land without due compensation. Many Chinese workers work in very unsafe conditions. These are structural problems. These are structural violations of their rights. These things are not that sensitive as are the political dissidents. These are areas that one can engage on, one can work on. One can work from economic collaboration on trade, one can work by training and other ways. And by the way, there are many in China that want to work on this, and that do work on this, and maybe don't even need US support.
Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit because we have a lot more questions and only about 20 more minutes. So Clay, lead off with this. Can we imagine a future China where educated millennials have advanced cell phones and enhanced interconnectivity via social media? As that trend continues and emerges and matures, what's going to happen? I mean, in a way, maybe it's a rhetorical question. Yes.
Well, excuse me. I suppose the assumption is that they're all going to want to read, the New York Times in Chinese or one of these others, and there's no evidence of that. Even before blocks and that sort of thing, the main thing people use their phones for is to hook up, to buy stuff, to share jokes, to talk about the food that they are eating, they want to eat, that sort of thing. This is the internet, right? And I didn't emphasize it, but the chart that I showed you earlier for Alibaba had more than half of the sales, that $131 billion in a single quarter. Those are better than Walmart numbers. In a single quarter, they did half of that via phones. And so people are using phones, but we shouldn't assume that they're going to use it to organize horizontally, to mobilize so as to pursue these common interests about remedying some sort of problem of any sort. So we shouldn't necessarily assume that. But what we do see is that Chinese love the internet. They get a lot out of it. And they are pretty happy with the internet they have, and not quite as fixated as we might imagine them on the internet that they don't have. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. But they hate any restriction. They absolutely loathe it. They think that they should have access to everything for free, right? So they don't like the blocking, they also don't like paywalls, right? So I think that's one of the things. But there have been a number of studies that have looked at, for example, how rural migrants, their most prized possession is their phone. It's their link to back home, it's their link to modernity, it's their link to new friends and all of these kinds of things. And it is transforming China. There's just no question about it in terms of the language people use and these sorts of things. And the innovations, we sometimes think that there's not a lot of innovation in Chinese industry. In fact, with regard to phones and applications and mobile uses, the Chinese are doing really quite a lot. And so it's not, we have this image of Weibo as the Chinese Twitter, but in fact it has functions that Twitter is only now getting. And Weixin we liken maybe to Facebook and things like that, but it has had features that Facebook is just now getting. So there's a lot going on with that. I just wanted to mention, and I apologize for doing this, about the human rights issue. And that's, people have more freedom than they've had in recent decades. There's no question about that. But a lot of that freedom is scary because it's the freedom to be jobless, it's the freedom to be homeless, it's the freedom to be without health insurance. And so not all freedoms are as appreciated as others. And there are organizations, Benjamin mentioned Jerry Cohen and all the work he's done, but there's an organization called Duihua that has done quite a lot, and where Americans and Chinese get together and talk concretely about things like juvenile justice and issues of this sort, how you deal with recidivism and other kinds of issues. So not every issue is a free speech issue, and I agree completely with Teresa. The Chinese government made Liu Xiaobo much bigger than he would have managed on his own. In the case that sent him to prison, they alleged that he had posted his writings on a foreign website and that 3,000 people had visited that website. That's a bad day for China's big bloggers. That's a seriously bad hour.
Okay, I'm going to try to move. Do you want to add something?
I was going to
quickly.
add something about the internet, and I think that many Americans or Westerners assume, oh, if only the Great Firewall didn't exist and Chinese people could easily access CNN and the New York Times and all these foreign news sites, that then their eyes would be opened and then they would overthrow the regime because they would understand the reality of their situation. But really, most savvy internet users in China most of the time can get around these blockages and access the information that they're looking for. And even so, many young people are extremely skeptical of Western news sites, even those who regularly consult those news sites. And one thing that I think is true of virtually all Chinese is they're very skeptical of all media sources. So they don't just, say, oh, whatever the People's Daily says, that must be the truth. They have the opposite view. They take everything with a great deal of skepticism, but that also includes foreign media outlets. And some of the most nationalistic young people in China today are on the internet all the time, continually accessing foreign news sites, and they actually are incredibly nationalistic and oftentimes very critical of the West.
Okay.
Just to say to give you one other perspective on this that's a bit different. There was a huge protest against a very large new planned industrial facility in Xiamen City in 2008. And the protest was organized through cell phones. So there is the potential. And actually, by the way, at the time, sure, yes. And by the way, at the time, a Chinese newspaper named these citizens the year's hero, similar to how the Time does that every year. So there has been instances, even before there was social media, where just a simple text, SMS messages were used to organize, which still has a potential role to play.
Okay, let's see. Have you did you lead off?
I can't remember
I'm
anymore.
not remembering. But
Why don't you answer this one, Charlotte?
yeah, oh, then I'm going to pick the one. I'm going to pick mine. Because this is a good question. What will the Chinese government do to deal with rural economic disparity? And we might add, do they really care? And then how is the government going to handle ethnic minority relations?
Finally,
I don't know.
Tibet.
Let's divide it into two. We'll start with rural economic disparity. Anybody?
I think we failed to answer that question once already.
Okay, okay.
The rural, there's disparity within locations, and then there's the broader gap between city and country, and also between east and west. China, the phenomenon in China is that you've got 95% of the people on 45% of the land. And now we can talk about the ethnic minority question, the 5%.
Okay, well, let's move on to the ethnic minority question.
I'd like to say more about the rural question.
By all means, please.
So, first of all, China has rapidly urbanized. So it's gone from an 80% rural population to, I think we're now near 50% rural, and soon there's going to be more people living in cities than in the countryside. Don't believe that the countryside is one thing. Yeah. Don't believe that a village is one thing. I've worked in one village from 2004, and then again periods up to 2009. In this village, first of all, you had the village leaders. They were immensely wealthy. They were much wealthier than most people I know in the city. They had multiple houses, they had big cars, they had companies. They were fully corrupt. They were also, through their corruption, could buy elections. And yes, that was a real democracy, because people were buying elections. Then you had a group of villagers who were quite rich because there was a lot of pollution from the factory, and they got some compensation for that. So they lived in strong pollution, but they were playing mahjong the whole day. They weren't on the land anymore. And then if you moved a little bit to the outside of the village, you were in the 19th century. It was dirt poor. And all of that in one village. And I'm talking about one of China's 1 million villages. So there's such a large, so if we're talking about rural disparity, it's not just between the urban and the rural, it's also within the rural. It's not just between the rich East Coast and the West. Look, if you go outside of Beijing, you drive an hour, you're going to be in dirt poor villages. So I think that's very important to remember. The disparity is everywhere. And by the way, the urban poor are also miserable. And by the way, some of the urban poor are living in villages within cities that you don't see, because on the outside it looks like a normal building. Inside there are many people cramped in small rooms that often come from the same villages. So what is the Chinese government doing about this? First of all, it's trying to urbanize the countryside. So it's trying to create these tiny urban centers in the countryside that lead to some growth, but also lead to the problem that a lot of people are losing their land. And when people lose their land, they lose their basic subsistence background. So one of the risks there is if there's an economic downturn, the earlier mechanisms, for instance, if you look at the 2008 crisis, a lot of the urban workers, the migrants, went back to land. By now, there's less of that land for them. So this is a real risk. I think the other big strategy has been to change the hukou system, the household registration system. So more people are allowed to move into larger cities and stay there. The big question is going to be, is there going to be social welfare for them? And that means a complete restructuring of the economy and dealing with inequality.
Oh, boy. All right. So let's move on to ethnic minorities. Teresa,
Okay.
5 minutes on ethnic
All right,
minorities.
I'll just say a few words.
Yeah.
Separatist violence between the Chinese leadership and China's Uyghur population and Tibetan population does seem to have been increasing in recent years, and this is a serious problem. And I don't really see any signs of it moving in a better direction, and I don't know, maybe Clay or somebody could have further insight or knowledge about that. But one thing that I would like to say is that the vast majority of the population of China is Han Chinese, and they don't appear to have any sympathy for the Tibetan and Uyghur separatists. In fact, especially as the Uyghur violence has accelerated in recent years and come into kind of Han Chinese areas, it seems to have only kind of strengthened the Han Chinese view that the government should strike hard against these groups. So I see that as kind of only heightening the cycle of violence and not really resolving it. But at the same time, I don't see any signs that this will lead the Han Chinese population, which is the population that the Chinese leadership is most worried about for the overall stability of the country, that it's going to kind of spread there as well.
Anyone else over here?
Just one quick note, and that's that you may have read, it appeared in the New York Times, the LA Times, and a bunch of other publications that last week a scholar at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences attacked specifically some American scholars of the last imperial dynasty, the Qing dynasty, and specifically went after them because they had described the expansion of the Qing Empire as the expansion, as an empire of conquest that seized Xinjiang and moved in Tibet and built an empire, took Taiwan, this sort of thing. And that argument, of course, has very little to do with the Qing dynasty and everything to do with today and tomorrow. What the government wants the message to be, that these are inseparable parts and that these folks are lucky to be part of China. And I think Teresa is right. Most Han, and Han hides more than it reveals because there's enormous diversity within that so-called ethnic group. But in any case, many of these people share the government's view that these folks have gotten railroads, they've gotten schools, they've gotten this, they should be happy, they should be grateful, and they shouldn't want to practice their faith or practice various customs. They should instead be appreciative of what they have.
Do you have anything? Okay, we're going to move on almost at the end now. Is China an economic threat to the United States? What should we think about that? Okay.
I would say China is an economic necessity at this point for the United States, as is the United States for China, as is Europe for the US, as is Europe for China, as is China for Europe. Unfortunately, this means that we're all in a very, very risky situation. So if Europe falters, which it might well, if we look at Greece, if we look at some of the other issues of non-growth, it will directly affect both China and the US, and because China is quite fragile, in my eyes, as is the US, we're going to have a problem. Same with China. So of course it's a threat because it's such a huge part of the world economy. if it goes wrong. If it goes well, it's very good.
Yeah, I take the threat in the question to mean whether or not China's economic rise is a threat to the United States. And if that's what the question is intending, I would say no, that China's economic rise on the whole has been a wonderful thing for the United States. Now, there are people who have lost their jobs, and that's tragic, and we need to do things to provide training and support and a social safety net for that. At the same time, we've all profited from cheaper underwear and everything else through our, we are simultaneously producers and consumers. So we have benefited from that. The people of China have benefited from China's economic rise. And the people in the areas around China have benefited selling things to China. So I think that we are all in this together, as Benjamin has just said, which of course means that we're all vulnerable, that we all need to do what we can to create systems that are mutually supportive rather than practicing a kind of mercantilism and saying, okay, we're only going to buy American, Chinese are only going to buy Chinese. Now that's a problem, and I think that's a big issue. The number one complaint from American business used to be, how do I find workers with the skills I need and hold on to them? When I say American business in China. Today, their big complaint is market access. Now, not all companies have this problem. Procter & Gamble sells half of the shampoo that's bought in China. But other companies that have higher tech products or in some ways strategic products are finding themselves increasingly locked out of markets. And that's a harm both to the Chinese, who would benefit from having the best quality technology, and of course from those who have that technology to sell. So that kind of protectionism is not healthy.
All right.
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
Okay,
Go ahead.
well, because this is sort of the final question. Here we've been talking about China for all this time, and these are China experts. So, we are China experts. We've been talking about China, and we haven't offered any views on what American policy toward China ought to be. All of you are potential advisors of the American policymakers and stakeholders in Washington. What would be your advice to them? And everybody has to answer.
Okay.
And that'll be it.
I guess to be succinct, my advice to American policymakers would be, don't blame China for all of America's problems.
Okay. Benjamin?
My advice would be, educate Americans about China and themselves, first. Second, keep on engaging with China. Third, don't let things escalate.
Okay.
My advice would be to tell them to listen to these two. I think America doesn't have this sort of thing. China used to have political study, kind of mandated study sessions for this and that. I think what the Plato Society, what you folks do voluntarily, it would be wonderful if this happened all across the United States, and engage your neighbors. So my suggestion is not for the president, my suggestion is to you. Talk to your neighbors about China. Reality check.
Oh, can we now thank everybody for a wonderful session? Yes, we didn't get to all the questions, but.
That's normal.